In the heart of Tokyo, within the vast echoing walls of the Metropolitan Gymnasium, a hush of anticipation filled the air. The arena, packed with martial arts enthusiasts from every corner of the globe, buzzed with quiet energy. Flags of martial disciplines, karate, judo, aikido, taekwondo, draped the rafters, each a silent nod to traditions carved across generations. Spotlights bathed the central stage where masters were about to showcase not just techniques but philosophies. Centuries of practice translated into movements so refined they transcended mere combat. Among them, an aging yet revered figure was about to step forward and deliver a performance unlike any other. Chuck Norris, 8-time World Karate Champion, U.S. Air Force veteran, and lifelong student of martial discipline, wasn't there to perform for applause. At 79, his presence alone commanded respect. This demonstration wasn't about flash or spectacle. It was about honoring the legacy of martial arts, about remembering that true strength lies in balance, humility, and control. But on this day, that sacred space would be challenged, not by an outsider, but by another legend, someone whose very name could spark controversy wherever it was uttered. Steven Seagal sat in the front row, arms folded, his dark glasses shielding eyes that had long watched from a place of quiet calculation. Dressed in black from head to toe, he exuded the confidence of someone used to being the center of attention. The smirk on his lips barely moved, yet it said everything. He wasn't impressed. A few seats behind Seagal, Master Ted A. Ain, 80-year-old icon in traditional karate, watched quietly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp. Where the crowd murmured with excitement, Ted remained still, the way only true masters know how. Backstage, Chuck tied the knot of his gi with calm precision. The kata he would perform, Kusanku, was a masterpiece of complexity, 43 movements blending blocks, strikes, and transitions into a fluid narrative of discipline. His breathing was steady, his posture serene. This wasn't a performance. This was a tribute. A young assistant approached. 5 minutes, sir. Chuck nodded with quiet appreciation. Nearby, a younger fighter whispered with a bit of tension, "You know Seagal's out there, right? He's been running his mouth all morning about how traditional styles are just museum pieces." Chuck didn't flinch. "Everyone's entitled to an opinion," he replied gently, "but I'm not here to argue with anyone. I'm here to honor the art." The young fighter looked at him, bewildered. "How do you stay so calm?" Chuck placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Because the first fight you win is with your ego. Everything else comes after." Then, with a composed step, he walked out to the center of the arena. Takashi Yamamoto, the veteran announcer of the event, addressed the audience with a commanding voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present to you a legend, a warrior of tradition, discipline, and honor. Please welcome the founder of Chunkukdo and 8-time World Karate Champion, Chuck Norris." Thunderous applause followed as Chuck stepped forward. He bowed not just to the crowd but to the judges, to his fellow masters, and to the very floor upon which he stood. In martial arts, space itself is sacred. Every movement begins with acknowledgement. Then, silence. Chuck stood still, his breath controlled, his focus absolute, and from the front row a low, barely audible chuckle. Seagal, leaning toward his entourage, muttered something with a smirk. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the gymnasium, it echoed. A few heads turned, some frowned, others held their breath. Chuck didn't react. He began. Each movement of the kata unfolded with a beauty that defied age, his stance rooted, his strikes sharp, precise, his transitions fluid as water. He wasn't dancing. He was embodying generations of technique, philosophy, and personal mastery. Halfway through, another laugh. This time, louder, deliberate. Chuck stayed focused. Even as some in the audience shifted uncomfortably, even as Master Ted's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, Chuck flowed through each move like a river finding its course. And then it ended. With a decisive block and final stance, Chuck stood motionless once more. The silence broke with a roar of applause, thunderous, appreciative, emotional. Everyone stood, everyone except Seagal and his entourage, who remained seated, arms crossed, faces unreadable. But the story wasn't over. As Takashi stepped forward to thank Chuck for his performance, another voice rose. "If I may," heads turned. Gasps whispered through the crowd. Steven Seagal was rising from his seat. The spotlight shifted as Steven Seagal ascended the steps onto the stage. His gait was slow, deliberate. In his hand, he extended a gesture toward Takashi, silently asking for the microphone. The announcer looked uncertain. This wasn't part of the program. His eyes darted to Chuck, who gave a small nod, a signal that said, "Let it play out." With that, Takashi stepped back, and Seagal took center stage. He stood not beside Chuck, but just ahead, subtly asserting dominance. To some, it was barely noticeable, but to those who understood martial culture, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't just a speech, it was a statement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Seagal began, his voice smooth, practiced, familiar to fans of his films. "What we've just seen was impressive." There was a pause, one so perfectly timed it reeked of insincerity. "Impressive," he repeated, in the same way a beautiful antique is impressive. "Elegant. But not exactly. Practical in today's world." Gasps rippled through the audience. Whispers turned into murmurs, some of protest, others of intrigue. Chuck remained still. "But let's be honest with ourselves," Seagal continued, turning his body slightly toward Chuck but never quite meeting his eyes. "These forms, these katas, their choreography. Beautiful, yes, but choreography all the same. And when you're in a real situation, when someone's life is on the line, choreography doesn't cut it." A section of the crowd clapped, others booed. The division was forming right there under the bright lights of the Tokyo Metropolitan Gymnasium. "Real combat," Seagal said, his voice now louder, rising above the din, "is about adaptability, about effectiveness, about doing what works, not what looks elegant." He paused. "With all due respect to Mr. Norris, maybe it's time we leave behind these outdated forms and embrace what's actually useful in the modern world." The tension in the room thickened. Master Teta's knuckles tightened around his cane. Several other senior martial artists leaned forward, faces darkened. Takashi took a step forward to reclaim the mic, trying to rein in what was clearly becoming more than a speech. But Seagal pivoted just slightly, still holding the microphone, still controlling the moment. In fact, Seagal's voice dropped into a deeper, more dangerous register. "I'd be happy to demonstrate the difference." And just like that, the challenge was out there, unspoken but undeniable. The entire arena inhaled at once. Chuck remained still as a stone, his face unreadable. Cameras zoomed in, trying to capture a flicker of emotion, but there was none. No anger, no surprise, no fear. He stepped forward calmly and extended a hand toward Seagal. The mic passed between them. "Thank you for your perspective," Chuck said evenly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "In my decades of training, I've found that different approaches serve different purposes. Traditional martial arts are not just about fighting. They are about building character, discipline, balance, respect." A wave of supportive applause rolled across the room. Chuck continued, "Effectiveness is not defined only by what wins a fight. Sometimes it's measured by what keeps you from needing to fight at all." Seagal's smirk tightened. "That's a lovely sentiment," he replied as he moved in again, reaching for the mic. "But let's not avoid the real question. If this was a real confrontation, would those movements have saved you? Or would you be relying on philosophy while the fight ends in seconds?" The crowd was now divided, visibly and vocally. Takashi interjected, trying to mediate. "This expo celebrates all traditions, both historical and modern interpretations. Let's respect each." Seagal raised his voice, cutting through Takashi's diplomacy. "Not what worked 100 years ago." He turned again toward the crowd. "Tell me, wouldn't you rather see a real demonstration, one that shows what's effective right now?" Shouts erupted, some cheering. Others shouting, "Disrespect!" The calm demonstration had turned into a storm. Chuck handed the mic back to Takashi and turned toward Seagal. "I didn't come here for a confrontation," he said. "I came to demonstrate the principles that have shaped my life." Seagal shrugged. "Then maybe it's time to prove they still work, or admit they don't. It was a trap, a carefully laid one. Decline, and Chuck would seem afraid. Accept, and he'd play into Seagal's game, a spectacle instead of a respectful exhibition." Chuck's gaze drifted to Master Teta, who gave a single, subtle nod. Sometimes, defending tradition requires stepping into unfamiliar territory. Chuck turned to Takashi. "This won't be a fight," he said. "It'll be a controlled demonstration of different approaches, no intent to harm. Just to compare principles." Takashi hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." And just like that, it was on. The crowd erupted. Phones flew into the air. Social media feeds lit up in real time. Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal were about to go head-to-head. In mere minutes, the polished wood floor that had hosted decades of respectful martial arts demonstrations became an arena. The bright overhead lights seemed to burn brighter, casting long shadows beneath the feet of the two legends now preparing to face each other. Chuck stood still, his breathing calm, his mind centered. Every movement, every breath, every stance had been refined over a lifetime. He had nothing to prove, but he also knew that walking away now would send a message to those who misunderstood martial arts as weakness in the face of modern aggression. Steven Seagal, on the other hand, shed his jacket with flair, revealing a black Aikido gi beneath. His body language radiated competence, some might say arrogance. He handed his jacket to a member of his entourage with a slight smirk that seemed permanently etched into his expression. "I'm ready when you are, Legend," Seagal said with a tone dipped in sarcasm. Chuck simply gave a small nod. He didn't need theatrics. He'd been ready for 50 years. Takashi raised the microphone once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to witness is an unscheduled comparative demonstration. Not a fight. Not a competition. But a contrast between two martial philosophies. Please respect the spirit of the expo." But his voice was lost in the tidal wave of energy roaring through the gymnasium. This wasn't just another segment in the program. This was history unfolding in real time. They faced each other across 8 feet of hardwood floor. Chuck wore his traditional white gi, crisp under the lights. His stance was balanced, open, relaxed, but undeniably strong. Seagal took an Aikido stance, hands raised in open palms, weight shifted slightly forward in readiness. The crowd fell into near silence as if collectively holding its breath. Then, with a subtle signal from Master Teta on the sidelines, it began. Seagal was the first to move, stepping forward with a sweeping palm strike aimed at Chuck's chest. It was fast, especially for a man of his build. But to the trained eye, it was also telegraphed, a test strike rather than a real attack. Chuck didn't counter. He didn't block. He simply wasn't there. With a minimal shift of weight and a slight body rotation, Chuck allowed the strike to pass through empty space, never breaking eye contact. To the casual viewer, it may have looked like nothing happened. But to martial artists watching closely, it was pure mastery efficiency in motion, the art of not being hit. Seagal recovered with exaggerated nodding. "Nice evasion," he said aloud. "Very traditional," Chuck said nothing. But eventually, Seagal added, "You'll need to do more than just avoid." He came in again, faster this time. A jab, followed by a classic Aikido wrist grab aimed to control Chuck's body. The crowd leaned forward. Chuck subtly shifted his forearm just enough to neutralize the grab, while repositioning his weight to disrupt the leverage Seagal was trying to establish. There was no flashy counter, no dramatic takedown, just a clean, quiet dismantling of the attack. Seagal took a half step back. "So you're going to keep dancing around?" he taunted. "Martial arts isn't about poetry, it's about results." Chuck responded with calm precision. "Martial arts is about responding appropriately to the moment, not escalating it." That drew nods of agreement from many senior martial artists in the audience. Master Teta watched intently, his face unreadable but his posture alert. Seagal's next combination was more committed. A feint to the left, a redirect into a circular grab textbook Aikido. This time, Chuck allowed the grab to land. But just as Seagal attempted to apply pressure, Chuck shifted again, subtly, intelligently. His balance neutralized Seagal's angle. From the outside, it may have looked like Seagal had gained control, but to those who understood, it was clear the technique had been diffused before it began. "You see," Seagal announced to the crowd, gesturing to the position they were in, "these old methods leave you vulnerable to modern techniques. From here, I could." He never finished the sentence. With an almost imperceptible movement, Chuck shifted his weight, causing Seagal to lose just enough balance to break the grip. Chuck stepped back, recentering himself. "Position comes before application," Chuck explained. "When your position is correct, strength becomes irrelevant." A ripple of appreciation spread across the audience. Even those unfamiliar with the deeper nuances could feel the significance of what they were watching. Seagal's expression hardened. The performance mask faltered just slightly. He had come expecting a philosophical opponent, someone to overwhelm with force. Instead, he was facing someone who simply wouldn't engage on those terms. He muttered under his breath, "Enough games." And with that, he launched a more aggressive flurry, a series of rapid entries and attempted takedowns, the room electrified with tension. Chuck responded not with force, but with precision. He interrupted wrist locks before they fully developed. He disrupted throws by shifting his weight. He guided Seagal's momentum past him, making him miss over and over again. To the untrained eye, it almost looked cooperative. But to those who knew, it was something far more rare. An elegant dismantling of every attack with no malice, no ego, just pure technique. After several failed attempts, Seagal stepped back, breathing heavier, clearly frustrated. "This isn't realistic," he said to the crowd. "In a real fight, you don't get the luxury of cooperating with your opponent." Chuck remained still, hands lowered, voice calm. "And in a real fight, restraint can end things before they begin." Takashi, sensing the shift in tone, tried to regain control. Perhaps now would be a good time for both masters to explain their techniques, but Seagal raised his voice over him. "Let's give them something real, not theory. Let's compare outcomes." Chuck didn't flinch. "If that's what the audience wants," Seagal pressed, "let's give them what they came for." It was now obvious to everyone, this was no longer a controlled demonstration. This was about pride, about legacy, about clashing ideologies in front of the entire world. Seagal wanted spectacle, Chuck wanted to preserve something sacred, but the crowd, they wanted both. The challenge now hovered in the air, heavy and undeniable. This wasn't a scripted exhibition anymore. It had evolved into something raw, unpredictable, a confrontation between two legends, two opposing martial philosophies. Steven Seagal removed the last piece of his outerwear and stepped fully into the light. His black Aikido uniform clung tightly to his frame as he rolled his shoulders with theatrical flair. "No intent to injure," he said aloud, "just to educate." But the grin curling across his face suggested a very different intention. Assistants quickly cleared the demonstration floor. Takashi gave one last attempt at moderating the tension. "This is a comparison of technique only. Please remember, this is not a contest." His words were lost in the roar of the crowd, now fully immersed in the drama unfolding before them. Chuck Norris stood calmly at the opposite end of the arena, unmoved by the chaos. His posture was not one of resistance, but of steady preparation. He wasn't here to fight. But if he had to step into that space to preserve the dignity of the art, then so be it. In the front row, Master Tieda watched silently. He had seen this story before, ego challenging humility, pride pressing against principle. The stakes were always greater than technique, and now the first physical engagement was about to begin. Seagal circled slowly, hands raised, testing Chuck's distance. "Traditional first," he called out. "Let's see what you've got." Chuck did not flinch. He didn't raise his hands or shift his stance. Instead, he watched, measuring not Seagal's body, but his intent. Seagal lunged forward. It was fast. An open palm thrust toward Chuck's center line, aggressive but not reckless. He wanted to see how Chuck would respond. Once again, Chuck wasn't there. With a minimal step and a slight shoulder rotation, Chuck moved off the line, allowing the strike to sail past. He didn't counter. He didn't touch Seagal. He simply recentered, calm as ever. A few audience members clapped, appreciating the subtlety. Others looked confused, expecting more visible action. But true martial artists in the crowd saw exactly what had happened. Chuck had responded perfectly, with no waste, no flash, just control. Seagal nodded, as if amused. "So, you're just going to dodge forever?" "Engagement isn't always physical," Chuck replied evenly. "Sometimes the wisest response is no response at all." Seagal scoffed. "Tell that to someone trying to take your head off." With that, he launched into a real combination, a strike, a feint, then a rapid arm grab typical of Aikido's controlling methods. His hands moved quickly, seeking to establish dominance over Chuck's center. But Chuck's timing was flawless. He shifted his forearm to break the angle, then stepped just slightly to neutralize Seagal's balance. Again, the audience saw no flashy reversal, no high kick, no throw, but Seagal's technique collapsed mid-motion, rendered ineffective by precise timing and positioning. Seagal took a step back, adjusting his footing. "You're just defending," he said, now loud enough for the entire arena to hear. Traditional martial arts in a nutshell. No initiative, all reaction. He came in again, this time with more intent. A committed sequence of techniques flowed from his hands, a jab, a turning step, then a joint manipulation. But Chuck didn't resist force with force. He used the energy Seagal gave him, turning, deflecting, redirecting. Every movement was deliberate. Every gesture had a purpose. What Chuck did was subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye. But to seasoned observers, it was a master class in control. Even Master Tedda's eyes glimmered with approval. Seagal, breathing heavier now, grew visibly frustrated. He needed to change the pace, shift the tone. "Let's do weapons," he said suddenly, "you and me." The suggestion hit like a spark in dry grass. There, on a nearby rack, sat a series of traditional wooden training weapons, the Bokane wooden sword, the Joa hardwood staff, and the Tanto, a wooden knife. These were not toys. They were serious training tools used to demonstrate technique under simulated combat conditions. Master Tedda spoke from his seat, his voice calm but clear. Weapons training reveals truth more clearly than empty hands. It clarifies principles. There is no hiding when wood meets wood. Chuck nodded respectfully. "I'd be honored." Seagal smiled, but his eyes narrowed. He selected the Bakken, the wooden training sword used in traditional Japanese martial arts, as a substitute for the katana, a weapon designed to strike. Chuck chose the Jo, a 4-foot hardwood staff, a symbol of simplicity and adaptability, a weapon used more often for defense than offense. Their choices spoke volumes. Seagal's weapon suggested power, force, aggression. Chuck's weapon suggested balance, versatility, and distance control. They returned to the center. The tension had shifted again. The previous exchanges were merely the prelude. Now, the audience sensed the real test was about to begin. Master Teda raised his hand, then dropped it slowly. "Hajime," he said quietly. "Begin." Seagal moved first. His bokken sliced through the air with a sharp diagonal cut, quick, aggressive, and clean. For a moment, it looked like he had the advantage. But Chuck's Joe moved with precise timing, rotating just enough to meet the attack, not head-on, but at an angle that redirected the force. The two wooden weapons clashed with a crack that echoed across the gymnasium. There was no contest of strength, no brute clash. Chuck simply moved, redirected, and stood again in perfect position. Seagal pivoted into a horizontal slash. Chuck responded with a subtle shift and a redirection of the Joe's end, avoiding the strike entirely. "You're just defending again," Seagal called out, annoyed. Chuck didn't reply. Seagal lunged, thrusting the bokken toward Chuck's midsection. It was fast, tighter than the earlier cuts. This time, Chuck's Joe rotated in a circular parry, blocking and disrupting Seagal's balance just enough to force him back. The crowd gasped. The timing, the angle, the control, it was breathtaking. "Initiative doesn't always mean going first," Chuck said quietly. "Sometimes it means controlling the space so completely that the other person can only react." Seagal said nothing. He gripped the bokken tighter and launched into a more aggressive series of cuts and thrusts. But now, Chuck's responses changed. Where earlier he had focused on redirection and minimal movement, now his Joe began to move with a bit more assertion, intercepting, redirecting, and occasionally pressing the attack. Still with restraint, still within control, but with unmistakable authority. The tempo increased. Wood struck wood with growing intensity. The audience was no longer divided. They were unified in awe. Every exchange revealed something more. Chuck's movements remained economical. Seagal's movements became larger, more forceful, occasionally betraying frustration. Then it happened. Seagal committed too much weight forward in a downward strike, just a fraction too far. A mistake invisible to casual viewers. But for Chuck, it was the opening. With a clean upward sweep of the Joe, he intercepted the bokken in mid-swing, disrupted Seagal's balance, and stopped the motion cold. And then he froze. Chuck stood still. The tip of his Joe now just inches from Seagal's unguarded throat. The arena fell silent. Everyone saw what had just happened. Chuck had won, not by striking, but by making his point without needing to finish the movement. It was absolute control. Seagal stood frozen for a moment, stunned, then took a step back. "Cute trick," he muttered. "But real fights aren't so clean." Before anyone could respond, he turned to the weapons rack once more. This time, he picked up the tanto, a wooden knife. Now, armed with both bokken and tanto, he returned to the floor. This was no longer tradition. This was escalation. The moment Steven Seagal picked up the tanto, a wooden training knife, tension returned like a sudden gust of wind. He now held a weapon in each hand, a bokken in the right and a tanto in the left. A dual-wielding demonstration in the middle of an exhibition that was never meant to escalate this far. Gasps spread through the audience. This wasn't just a technical decision. It was symbolic. It was Seagal saying, "I'm taking this up a notch. Meet me or step aside." Chuck said nothing, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't reach for a second weapon. Instead, he adjusted his grip on the Joe, spreading his hands just an inch farther apart. A subtle change, but one that said he was now engaging differently, prepared to face two weapons with one. Simplicity versus complexity. Restraint versus escalation. Master Teda remained seated, but his voice, clear and precise, rang out across the arena. Let the weapon be an extension of principle, not a substitute for it. Seagal didn't respond. He was too focused now, circling again, searching for an opening. He moved first, a horizontal sweep with the bokken, feinting high while the tanto came in low, aiming toward Chuck's ribs. The crowd inhaled sharply. But Chuck responded with seamless control. His Joe rotated midair, redirecting the bokken wide, then dipped in a tight spiral to intercept the tanto's thrust before it could land. The motion was fluid, one gesture serving two purposes. Seagal stepped back, surprised. He reset his stance and attacked again. This time, the tempo increased. He launched a rapid series of combination strikes, alternating from sword to knife and back again, trying to break Chuck's rhythm, to overload his defenses. The crowd leaned forward, eyes tracking the blur of motion. And yet, Chuck never faltered. The Joe moved like a living extension of his body. Not a weapon, but a philosophy made manifest. He used both ends with equal skill, one to block, the other to counter, always redirecting, never clashing. For a brief sequence, the two men danced across the arena like shadow and light. Seagal's style was aggressive, pressing, trying to corner. Chuck's response was grounded, circular, never staying in one place long enough to be pinned. Then, Seagal attempted something risky. He swept horizontally with the bokken while simultaneously lunging with the tanto, an attempt to divide Chuck's attention. It was a classic two-weapon trap meant to create confusion and force the defender to make a mistake. But Chuck didn't defend the way anyone expected. He stepped into the attack. Yes, into it. In a moment that felt like slow motion, Chuck moved through the collapsing gap, his jaw spinning in a tight arc. It intercepted the bokken mid-swing, disrupting Seagal's balance, then spiraled downward to catch the path of the tanto. In that one motion, Chuck nullified both weapons. Then, as Seagal's arms were momentarily immobilized, Chuck stopped, his jaw gently but firmly pressing upward, the tip just under Seagal's chin. A clean finish, elegant, unmistakable. The audience gasped in unison. This time, even Seagal froze. They remained like that for a heartbeat. Chuck in complete control, Seagal locked in place, both weapons defeated not by aggression, but by calm execution. Chuck stepped back again, returning to a neutral stance, jaw vertical at his side, his breathing steady. The meaning was clear. If this had been real, the outcome would have been absolute. Seagal lowered both weapons slowly, his expression unreadable. He wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't taunting. He simply stood there, taking in the moment. But ego is a powerful thing. I hope everyone knows, he said aloud, that in a real confrontation, things are never this, tidy. Chuck remained silent. Seagal adjusted his stance again. Let's try something more intense, shall we? Before Takashi could stop him, Seagal rushed forward with another attack, this one faster, less controlled. The bokken cut the air with a hiss, the tanto stabbing in tight arcs. There was less care now, more muscle, more frustration. Takashi stepped forward. Please remember this is still a demonstration. But his plea fell on deaf ears. Chuck's response this time was firmer. He intercepted the bokken with a clean block that stopped its momentum completely. For a brief instant, the two men were locked, their weapons frozen midair. Seagal pressed with physical effort. Chuck didn't yield. And then, quietly, almost too softly to hear, Chuck spoke. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about what the art teaches us. He was losing control, not just of the demonstration, but of the narrative he had tried to build. He raised his bokken again. In the real world, Seagal said, you finish the fight, no second chances, no philosophy, just results. He came in with a powerful thrust, one that cut low toward Chuck's midsection. Chuck's jaw didn't just deflect it this time, it controlled it. He used the staff to intercept, then subtly altered Seagal's angle. The move not only redirected the blade, but also left Seagal's left side exposed, a moment of vulnerability that any serious martial artist could have exploited. Chuck didn't. Instead, he paused, once again demonstrating that he could have ended the exchange but chose restraint. This, more than anything, caused a shift in the room. The crowd, once hungry for conflict, now seemed quieter, more introspective. They were witnessing something deeper than a match. They were witnessing a philosophy in action. Master Teta nodded slightly, his approval quiet but clear. What Chuck was doing wasn't just about martial arts, it was about principle, about how you choose to carry the power you've earned. Seagal, breathing heavier, began to slow. He'd attacked, pushed, escalated, and still, Chuck had not only weathered it, he had done so without losing himself. It was a different kind of victory, one that couldn't be measured in points or strikes. It was character made visible. Seagal stepped back, bokken and tanto still raised, but his body language had changed. The certainty was no longer there. The man who had stepped onto the stage to prove dominance was now questioning the ground he stood on. The silence that followed Seagal's last retreat wasn't empty. It was full of realization, full of quiet reckoning, full of something deeper than applause. Chuck stood as he had from the beginning, calm, centered, unshaken. The jaw still rested lightly in his hands, not as a threat, not as a tool of domination, but as an instrument of principle. Seagal's breathing slowed as he began to circle again. His voice, when it came, still tried to reclaim control. In real situations, he said, his tone lowered but still audible to the crowd, there are no rules about one-on-one. You don't know what's coming. And then, without asking, without consulting anyone, he raised his hand and gestured toward his entourage. A man in black approached the edge of the mat and tossed something toward him, a second tanto. Seagal caught it with practiced ease, now armed with 3 weapons, one long blade in his right, 2 shorter ones in his left. The murmur from the crowd turned into full-on concern. This was no longer a comparative demonstration of styles. This was a man trying to overwhelm not just physically, but symbolically. Even Takashi looked alarmed, stepping forward once again. Mr. Seagal, this was never intended to become a live sparring session, but Master Teta raised his hand, stopping him. The old master's gaze remained focused. He wasn't watching for aggression. He was watching for transformation. Chuck's expression didn't change. He simply readjusted his stance, now clearly aware that the structure of the exchange had shifted again. But still, no fear, no change in breathing, no hint of anger. "If that's the path you've chosen," Chuck said simply, "then I'll meet you there." Seagal struck. This time, the speed was extraordinary. The Tanto in his left hand came in with a tight circular stab while the Boken swept horizontally from the right. The second Tanto lingered, poised for a third follow-up. Chuck responded instantly. His jaw spun in a full-body arc, a complete utilization of the staff's length. The rear end caught the incoming Tanto, deflecting it outward. The midpoint absorbed the Boken strike with a hollow thock that echoed sharply. Then, without pause, Chuck stepped inside the rhythm, his movement placing the Joe's front end just under Seagal's wrist before the third blade could enter the sequence. What followed happened so fast, most in the crowd didn't register it until it was done. Chuck lifted, just an inch. And everything changed. Both Seagal's arms lifted slightly, just enough to throw off his balance. Chuck used the moment to slide the Joe across Seagal's body with clean, efficient precision, effectively binding all three weapons in one motion. A beat later, the tip of the Joe rested gently, precisely at Seagal's chest. The room gasped. Again. And Chuck stepped back. The Joe returned to his side. He could have ended it again and again and again, but he hadn't. This time, Seagal didn't speak. He stood still, both blades lowered at his sides. The anger in his posture had drained. The bravado melted. His shoulders, once lifted high with self-assurance, now dropped slightly. Not in defeat, but in recognition. Chuck bowed, not to show dominance, but to show respect. It was a gesture rooted in something Seagal hadn't expected: humility, control, honor. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, quietly, Seagal returned the weapons to the stand. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Master Tadea finally spoke. Perhaps both demonstrations have shown us something valuable. There was no thunderous cheer, no chants, no overwhelming noise. Instead, there was the unmistakable hush of understanding. The quiet acknowledgement of something far more meaningful than victory. Character. Everyone had come expecting to see a confrontation. What they had witnessed was a lesson. As the demonstration concluded, Chuck returned the Joe to its resting place with the same care he had shown from the start. Every movement remained precise. Grounded. And when he turned back to face the audience, he bowed again, not for applause, but in gratitude. The room rose as one. It wasn't the clamor of spectacle, it was the weight of respect. Master Tadea gave one final nod. The true essence of martial arts is not power, it is restraint. The crowd didn't just hear the words, they felt them. And somewhere behind all of that, Seagal stood quietly, absorbing everything. A man who had stepped into the arena to prove something to the world, and perhaps learned something about himself instead. As the crowd filed out of the Tokyo Metropolitan Gymnasium that evening, a strange duality hung in the air. On the surface, the event was over. Lights dimmed, mats were rolled, cameras were packed up, yet, beneath all that, the echoes of what had just unfolded lingered like the final notes of a powerful song. Whispers filled the hallways. That wasn't just a demonstration. I've never seen Seagal so quiet. Did you notice how Chuck never once tried to win? And yet, somehow, he did. Clips of the exchange were already lighting up social media feeds. Millions of views began to accumulate within hours. But it wasn't the punches or the blocks that people kept watching. It was the restraint, the discipline, the contrast between Seagal's forceful style and Chuck's centered presence. Meanwhile, backstage, Chuck Norris walked quietly through the corridor, his gi still neatly tied, his expression unchanged. To those around him, he offered warm nods, gentle smiles. There was no air of superiority, no celebration. Just quiet composure. A young fighter approached him, eyes wide with admiration. "Mr. Norris," he said, nearly breathless, "you showed the whole world today what true martial arts really means." Chuck smiled. "That's not something you show once. It's something you live every day." A few moments later, one of the expo's organizers hurried up to him. "Mr. Norris, Master Tadea has requested your presence. He's waiting in the tea room." Chuck nodded and made his way through a quiet hallway, removed from the bustle of the arena. The tea room was simple: tatami mats, sliding paper doors, a low table. The space felt sacred, distant from the noise of competition and confrontation. Master Tadea sat kneeling by a small teapot, steam rising gently between them. He gestured for Chuck to join him. No words were needed. The ritual of tea began, slow, deliberate, as much a meditation as a task. They poured, they sipped, And then Teta spoke softly. Today was not what anyone expected. Chuck nodded. Nor what I intended. But perhaps, the master continued, it was what we needed. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just full. Teta's gaze remained steady. You taught something today that couldn't be captured in any kata. Something that went beyond movement, beyond style. Chuck looked down for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I wasn't trying to teach, he said. I was trying not to forget. The old master nodded. Even more important. Then the sliding door opened quietly. Steven Seagal stood at the threshold. He was no longer in uniform, dressed in all black as always, but now there was a different weight to his posture. Not the weight of ego, but perhaps the first signs of reflection. They told me I wasn't allowed back here, he said with a forced half smile, but I never liked rules. Master Teta simply gestured to the open seat. Seagal paused, surprised by the invitation, but he entered, removed his shoes, and sat. The silence returned. He reached for the tea, but stopped halfway. I wanted to say, your staff work was solid, he finally muttered to Chuck. Not flashy. But effective. Chuck nodded. Your sword control showed experience. You've clearly trained hard. Seagal didn't respond right away. He just stared at the teacup. Then, in a voice lower than before, more honest, he said, I didn't expect it to go that way. Teta interjected gently. Rarely do the most important moments go according to script. I came here to prove something, Seagal admitted. To remind people that I'm still a force in martial arts. You are, Chuck replied with sincerity. But martial arts isn't about force. It's about what you do with it. Seagal looked up, their eyes locking. You could have made me look foolish out there. But you didn't. That wasn't the point. Then what was? Chuck answered without hesitation. To show that mastery isn't about beating someone. It's about mastering yourself, especially when the world expects you not to. We all struggle with the balance between self-expression and self-control, he said. Some wrestle with it in silence. Others, like today, in front of thousands. There was no rebuttal. Seagal looked down, his fingers slowly rotating the teacup. I used to believe martial arts was about ending things quickly, about control, about never showing weakness, but watching you today made me think of something my first teacher once said. He looked up again. He said, a true warrior doesn't dominate the space. He fills it with stillness. Chuck smiled softly. That sounds like a wise teacher. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. It was no longer two legends across a line. It was three men sharing space, sharing silence, and maybe, just maybe, sharing understanding. Outside, the gymnasium continued its preparations for the next day's schedule, but something had shifted. The buzz among the participants and the students was no longer about who won or lost, but what had been revealed, that martial arts at its core isn't a method, it's a mirror. The next morning, Tokyo rose under a soft golden light. Day 2 of the International Martial Arts Expo began, but the energy was different. Something had shifted in the minds of everyone who'd witnessed what had happened the day before. Back at the gymnasium, long before the doors opened to the public, Chuck Norris moved quietly through one of the side practice rooms. He wore his gi again, as crisp as ever, and moved through his personal routine with complete presence. No cameras. No audience. Just him and the silence. Each kata he performed was deliberate, slow, strong, focused. This was where martial arts lived. Not in applause, but in repetition. In discipline, in being better than yesterday. Master Teta joined him after a time, bowing respectfully before stepping onto the mat. There are many questions, he said gently, especially from the young ones. Chuck nodded. Let them ask, Teta continued, but the questions that matter most weren't about technique. Chuck stopped mid-form, curious. Then what were they about? They asked. Teta said, why you chose restraint when you were provoked. Why you bowed when you could have humiliated. Why you protected when you had the perfect chance to dominate. Chuck let the words settle. Those, Teta said with a small smile, are questions that will stay with them for years. As the doors to the gymnasium opened once again and the audience flowed in with excited chatter, something had changed. The stage was the same. The banners still fluttered, but the crowd now carried the memory of yesterday's confrontation, not as a battle, but as a message. That morning, Chuck's next scheduled demonstration was announced. As he stepped out onto the floor, the crowd rose to their feet in a quiet, unified standing ovation. Not in celebration of celebrity, but in recognition of what he had shown them the day before. Chuck bowed, then addressed the audience directly. Yesterday, many of you witnessed an unplanned demonstration, he began, and it's caused quite a bit of conversation. There were knowing laughs in the audience, he continued, but today I want to return to why we're really here. To explore what traditional martial arts training can offer beyond the techniques. beyond the styles, beyond even the forms. Because martial arts is not just about what you can do to another person. It's about what it teaches you about yourself. Throughout the next 20 minutes, Chuck demonstrated various traditional drills and principles, stances, transitions, breathing, posture. But what the audience responded to most was not the movement. It was the meaning. Each time he demonstrated something, he paired it with reflection. This isn't just a block, he would say. It's a lesson in listening. This isn't just a strike, it's a reminder that force without direction is just chaos. After the demonstration, as Chuck bowed for the final time that day, the applause was different, quieter, more reverent. And then, unannounced, unexpected, Steven Seagal walked out onto the floor, alone. No entourage. He wasn't holding a sword. He wasn't making a statement. He simply approached Chuck and extended his hand. Chuck took it. And in that gesture, wordless and powerful, they told the crowd more than any match ever could. Later that evening, the two men met again, this time at a quiet restaurant tucked away in a side street of the city. Seagal had suggested it, a place without photographers, without agents, without microphones. They talked, not as performers, not as competitors, but as two martial artists who had walked very different paths. You know, Seagal said between sips of sake, when I first started in Aikido, it wasn't about showing off. It was about something pure, something internal. Chuck nodded. The journey changes us. Or, we let it change us, Seagal added. Hollywood doesn't reward humility. Chuck smiled gently. No, but life eventually demands it. They talked deep into the night about training, about tradition, about how hard it is to stay grounded when the world lifts you too high. The next day, the expo ended with a closing ceremony featuring a roundtable discussion with several martial arts masters. Among them, Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal, seated side by side. The moderator posed the question everyone had been waiting to hear. How do we balance tradition and innovation? How do we preserve what matters while adapting to what's needed? Seagal was the first to respond. And to many people's surprise, his answer was measured. Martial arts have always evolved, he said. The styles we call traditional today were once innovations, but innovation without understanding becomes chaos, and tradition without openness becomes dogma. Chuck followed. Techniques change, applications evolve, but the principles, discipline, respect, humility, courage, those don't go out of style. They weren't witnessing rivalry anymore. They were witnessing reconciliation. When the panel ended, Takashi invited all the masters on stage for one final bow. As Chuck and Seagal stood side by side, the entire audience rose again. Not out of fan frenzy, but because something real had happened over these past few days. Something that touched deeper than punches or parries. It had started with mockery. It ended with mutual respect. Weeks passed. The footage from the Tokyo Expo continued to circulate across social media, reaching far beyond the martial arts community. It was shared not just as a highlight clip, but as a story. A moment of unexpected humility. A confrontation that turned into a conversation. Memes faded, but the moment endured. Chuck Norris returned to his ranch in Texas, back to the quiet rhythms of training and teaching. His phone didn't stop ringing. Requests for interviews, invitations to appear on talk shows, even offers for a feature-length documentary. But he declined most of them. This isn't a spectacle, he said to one journalist. It's a reminder. Meanwhile, Steven Seagal surprised many when he announced a seminar tour, not in front of cameras or on movie sets, but at dojos and community centers across Southeast Asia. The posters were simple, no flash. Just a black and white image of Seagal in meditation, with the words, "Reconnecting with the Path." And true to his word, he appeared in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Vietnam, in small dojos with bamboo floors and no air conditioning, teaching children who had never seen a Steven Seagal film. In one such place, a young girl asked him, "Sensei, what's more important, being strong or being kind?" Seagal paused, and then said, "Strength without kindness is just noise, but kindness, that takes true strength." Some said he was changing, others said he was trying to reclaim something he'd lost. Maybe both were true, but what couldn't be denied was that something had shifted in the legacy of both men. The martial arts world responded in kind. In one Taekwondo federation, dojos began hosting respect days, where students practiced forms in silence, not to win, but to reflect. Aikido schools started adding dialogue circles to the end of sessions, allowing students to talk about what martial arts meant in their personal lives. And in one small studio in Brooklyn, a young instructor shared the video of the Norris-Seagal face-off with her students, not to analyze techniques, but to discuss character. "This," she told them, "is what real power looks like." Then, one morning, a letter arrived at Chuck Norris's foundation office. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged. The signature at the bottom? Steven Seagal. It read, "Chuck, I came to Tokyo looking to prove something, but what I found was far more valuable. You reminded me of why I started in the first place, not to fight others, but to face myself. Thank you for not humiliating me when you had every right to. That silence spoke louder than any victory. I hope our paths cross again." Steven. Chuck read it, smiled, and placed it in his desk drawer. Some things don't need to be broadcast. They just need to be remembered. And maybe that's the ultimate lesson in martial arts. Not how hard you can hit, but how deep your choices echo. Not how fast you can dominate a room, but how long your impact lingers after you leave it. In the end, the crowd may have gasped at the first punch, but what truly left them breathless was the lesson that followed. The silence that taught more than any shout ever could, and the unlikely peace between two warriors once divided by pride, now united by purpose.